If you've got your Bibles, we're going to start here with 1 John chapter 3. The lesson tonight that we're going to be focusing on is the subject of sin. And it always surprises me. I guess it shows my own limitations here. But it always surprises me that some people have problem with the concept of sin. It makes me wonder if we're effectively communicating a thought here or not. But in all fairness, there are a lot of different philosophies, a lot of different world religions that teach things that are much less than sin. Hinduism has had a huge impact on a lot of people, even the people who are not Hindu. And Hinduism does not teach the concept of sin that we're going to be talking about tonight. It focuses more on the problems in the world, evil, that which we say is not good. They would say, the philosophy of Hinduism would say, is a result of ignorance. It's a result of ignorance. It's because people don't know what they need to know, and that's why things don't work out the way they should. Okay, just saying that, and I know I'm brushing with broad strokes here, but just saying that, I'm guessing you can already see how you don't have to be influenced by Hinduism to buy into that kind of philosophy. But that's where you can trace it. Hinduism is extremely old world religion, and this kind of philosophy has been around a long time before educational talk was very popular. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but because there are two major alternatives to what the Bible teaches in regard to sin. And one would be the idea of ignorance, world problems, evil, that which is not good as a result of ignorance. And that finds its root in Hinduism. The other major alternative would be not so much ignorance, but weakness. Weakness. And that as far as background philosophy, that mainly comes from the existentialists. Now, I'm going to go over some of these things very quickly because I don't think it's really important to know a lot of those little details. I'm just really concerned about what the Bible says. But every time I say something like that, I want to make sure that I go ahead and define it. What is existentialism? Existentialism has been quite popular in the last couple of hundred years. And in fact, in recent years, it's quite popular, and a lot of people are existentialists when they don't even realize it. But it's a kind of philosophy. Are you aware of what existentialism is? Okay, the first major class I ever had in college on existentialism, there was an illustration that was used that I'll never forget. And I'm going to share this with you, and it's just an illustration. So I know people can tear it apart, but this is going to get you in the arena. Okay, this is going to present the concept to you. If most of us, if you think of your childhood and things like that, riding in the back of a school bus that has those kind of shock system that there are no shock absorbers, it just kind of, and as you go, you're bouncing up and down. Well, when you're riding in the back of the school bus and you're going down a bumpy road and you look out the window, what does it look like? Everything's bouncing all around. Well, most of us, especially in Western culture, would understand I'm bouncing around, and everything looks like it's bouncing, but I'm the one bouncing around. Existentialists don't look at things that way. Existentialists say that even though you can scientifically prove that I'm the one going up and down, that's not what matters. What matters is what life looks like from my perspective. So an existentialist would say the world is going up and down. Sounds really weird, doesn't it? Okay, that gets you into the arena of what existentialism is all about. Your existence from your perspective. That's why they call it existentialism. So the number one value is totally within you and your perception and the way it impacts you and the way you feel about life. Do you understand why this is so popular today? Okay, what if you base your morals, well, a lot of people do, base their morality and their value system and everything on It's just totally my perspective. Well, what if other people were hurt? Well, as long as I don't think about it, that doesn't bother my conscience, and so that's an existentialist can go with that. There are several major influential existentialists. Okay, I'm sorry I'm diverting on this, but since I mentioned it, I want to say this. There's a guy by the name of Nietzsche. Have you heard of Nietzsche? He is one of the more famous existentialists, right? As an existentialist, he, I don't want to get into too much, other than the fact that he had a major influence on a young German man who adopted his philosophy. Who was that young German man? Adolf Hitler. Adopted his idea of the super race, the Obermann, the Superman, you know what Adolf Hitler did with that, with his idea. But it's based on, if you talk to him about right and wrong, you've got to remember it's existentialism. And existentialism isn't out there. It's not based on anything you can show me. By the way, they're not stupid. They don't deny science or anything like that. But values and reality in what's important doesn't come into effect. Okay. I'm sorry I spent that much time on this. But these are the two major alternatives. The alternatives are weakness and ignorance, not sin. Okay, because of that, some of the sacred cows in the world in which we live would be, if one of the major problems, the reason we have evil and shortcomings and everything else is because of ignorance, then a sacred cow would be, we could fix it if we just educated people. How many times, maybe I've done this more because I've been affected by some of this studying, or my upbringing. But how many times do you hear people say, well, it's because we need to educate them better. We just need to educate them better. I wish I would have done this in preparation, but obviously I'm off track anyway, and I didn't know I was going to say this. But I remember clearly reading a study, and this has probably been 15 years ago now, and it was a study done of Ivy League school graduates. It was done in the Northeast, where we have a lot of the Ivy League schools, right? And we're talking about people with PhDs and all sorts of these prestigious degrees from these kind of Ivy League schools, and they were evaluating because they were trying to evaluate this idea. You know what? If people were just educated, if they just understood, then they wouldn't have as much evil in the world, right? Well, they looked at the national average as far as things like domestic violence is concerned, and other things like that as far as conflict with other people, especially your ability to get along with other people. And they found out that they didn't score the national average, it was worse. People with a greater education actually had a greater tendency to have conflict with other people and more domestic violence and things like that. One of these days I'm going to have to pull that study back out, because I really get up to here with people saying, well, if we just had a better education system. I am all for education, I really am. But that is not going to solve the problems of the world. Problems of the world are a moral problem, they're not an education problem. Okay, well, if these are the two major alternatives, if it's ignorance, then we see this idea, one of the sacred cows we've got in our culture today is education. Everybody's always talking about, we just need to have more programs, more education. And by the way, have you seen how many teachers have been in the news in the last weeks? And what teachers are in the news for? Anyway, education. If the other one's weakness, you know what another sacred cow is? Empowerment. You ever hear people talk about all we need to do is empower people, give them the ability to do the stuff that they, the right, the freedom, or whatever to do, what they can do? Well, I'm interested in the fact that that should not surprise us. Should not surprise us, because those are alternatives to listening to God. What God says the problem humanity faces is sin. So the source of evil, that which is wrong, all the bad in the world, it's sin. Okay, what do we mean when we say sin? There's a little fuzziness there. We know sin means you did wrong. right? I hope we know that. Okay, let's start with as biblical definition as we can possibly get. I'll quickly go over these terms that are used in the Bible. Don't want to bore you with that, but I want you to be familiar with it and what they mean. But let's start with the classic passage here. There are going to be a bunch that emphasize the same idea, so I'm just giving a couple of samples of the different categories. First thing we're trying to do, talking about sin in this lesson, is let's define it. So 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4 says, everyone who sins breaks the law. In fact, sin is lawlessness. Okay, that's a pretty basic definition, isn't it? Sin is breaking the law. Okay, I wish we could stop there, but we can't. Because we have to ask ourselves the question, what law are we talking about? Okay, because laws vary from country to country, from area to area. In fact, it's really quite funny to, have you ever heard about some of the laws that are still on the books in some of these places? Really, you're not supposed to be chewing gum on Sundays. Anyway, that's obviously not what we're talking about. What is this passage talking about? It's talking about God's law. If God has set up a standard, if God has made a law, to violate that law would be sin. Okay, let me quickly go over the terms used in the New Testament. The only one I'm really concerned about is this one right here, because it's the most used term in the New Testament for sins. It's rough breathing, hamartia. Have you ever heard this before? Hamartia. The word hamartia literally means to miss the mark. Okay, to miss the mark. What visual comes to your mind? Target. Target. Okay, we've already got our basic definition here. What's the bullseye on the target?
God's law.
God's law. So coming short of God's law would be one of the words for sin. One of the words for sin. Okay, here are the other words for sin used in the New Testament. The planao simply means to go astray. Well, that kind of sounds like missing the mark, doesn't it? Yeah. Kind of like there's a standard we're supposed to live by and you kind of got off the path or whatever. There's one interesting aspect of this word, though. It means going astray willfully. There's a difference between slipping off the path versus saying, you know what, this is a tough path, I'm just taking a break. I'm just going to reverse. Okay, it's a willful thing. So going off the path, missing the mark. Atakos is many times, if some of you sign up for the Greek class later on. Little plug here. You're going to sign up for it, aren't you? I know a couple of people, Mary. Okay. When you have the alpha, many times in the Greek language you put an alpha in front of the word that negates it. So, dikaiosune is the root of this word, means righteousness. But when you take the alpha and you put it in front of it, it means unrighteous. Okay, what does the word righteousness or righteous mean in the Bible? What does it mean to be righteous?
Right by God.
Okay, right by God's standards. This all seems pretty close, doesn't it? As far as it's lawlessness. There's like it's almost like let's back up and let's hit this from several different angles, but that's pretty much what we're doing with these words. Okay, apitheo. Apitheo means to disobey. And again, the question is disobey what? Okay, same thing. Okay, parabino simply means to transgress or to go over. To go over what? Go over the boundary, go over the line that God has set up. So I just throw that out there simply to give you the definitions, because all the definitions really sound like we're getting at the same point, don't they? Okay, so it brings us back to this question: what are we talking about when we talk about God's law? Because sin is breaking God's law, violating God's law, missing the standard, not living up to the standard. Hebrews, I didn't put this one up there. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12, if you're taking notes. Matthew chapter 15, verse 19. I did put this one up there. Matthew chapter 15, verse 19. Let's flip over to the Gospel of Matthew. Whoever gets there first, just read that for me. Matthew 15, 19.
For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander.
Okay, I've got a long list of scriptures here, but that's one of the classic ones that makes a point. I don't want us to fall into this mistake of saying that I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything. Sin is not just missing the mark by doing something wrong or failing to do something right. We already mentioned that with Jay, of all people, with his illustrate. Okay, doing something wrong or failing to do something right, that is God's standard, that's God's law, right? But it's not just those two, it's also something that can be done on the inside. Sin is not just an act, it is also a thought. Anytime the inclination of the conscience is to avoid God's standard, not obey God's standard, or fail to keep God's standard. Whether you act it out or whether you have that kind of heart. Remember what Jesus said about adultery? In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew, the 5th chapter, he says, you've heard it said that you shall not commit adultery, but I say unto you, what? Yeah, yeah. If you have committed it in your heart, it's the same as committing the act. Since I bring that up, let me go ahead and clarify this. This is not saying a thought passed through your mind. It is saying, though, that if in your heart you said to yourself, well, if I could do that and get away with it and not get caught, I would. It's that kind of inclination of the heart. If you have that kind of inclination that you would do it if nobody would catch you, then you, in God's eyes, it's as good as having done it. Okay, the classic passage that we really have to go to before we can get to these, we're going to be in Romans. Let's go to Romans 3:23, and then we'll hit some of these other verses. Romans chapter 3, verse 23 is very classic because this is the passage that builds up to the point that everybody's a sinner. So if sin is lawlessness, it's disobeying, not keeping. Let's put it that way, not keeping, because it can be overt, it can be a sin of commission or omission. So it's failure to abide by the standards of God, whether in action or in desire. It can be on the outside or the inside. That's a pretty broad umbrella. But let's get a little bit deeper here to try to understand this. Romans chapter 3. I'm sorry for the people who were in Foundations class Sunday because we're covering some of the same material, but I've got to say this. Romans, the 3rd chapter, is a classic passage to go to talk about a subject like this. Because if you can review with me in your mind what's going on in the book of Romans, the first 17 verses of the book of Romans, Apostle Paul starts off, and the reason he's writing the letter is because he hasn't had a chance to go to Rome. Right? And so he's setting up this introduction saying, I really wish I could go there. Because if I were there in person, I would share the gospel with you. What does the word gospel mean? Wow, good news. It's good news. And he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Why? Because it's the power of God unto salvation. It's good news because this is what gets you right with God. Okay, that's to me, and I'm not doing this very much justice because it's a flowery introduction. It's one of these things where it's kind of like, wow, man, Paul, I'm so glad you're writing this letter, because this is good stuff. I'm really looking forward to this. So that's his introduction, the first 17 verses. And then verse 18, he starts this, okay, I can't visit you, so I'm just going to tell you this great news. Here it is. Verse 18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth in their ungodly living. Because what they should have known about God has been clearly made known to them, and so they are without excuse. And then he just goes downhill from there. Right? And so he's talking about the wrath of God, about the sinfulness of men, and how they don't have any excuse. And he gives some really dreadful examples of it before you get out of the first chapter. And you think, okay, I'm glad the first chapter is over. Second chapter is worse. Second chapter is just, whoa. And then the third chapter is kind of like, okay, this is not only, we've had this revealed to us and we didn't live up to it. And we're all, big problem with sin. But the third chapter builds up to the fact that You know what? And it's everybody. And he doesn't just say it's everybody. He says, he goes redundantly into making this point. There's none righteous, no, not one. Anywhere you look, we're all, it's a terrible problem. We've all got this problem. Oh, okay, that's chapter 3. That's the background to this. Chapter 3, verse 20. What does he say? Therefore, no one, this is chapter 3. Yeah, I didn't want to go to verse 20. I want to go to verse 23 first. We're going to come back to verse 20. Sorry. Keep me on line here. You heard me? Just okay. Verse 23, what does it say? It says, he's been building up to this. This is not just picking this verse out of this context. All you got to do is start at the beginning of the 3rd chapter and read all the way down. It's one of these passages as you're reading, it's like slapped and beat up as you read down through, and you get to this point where he says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Okay, the word here is hamartia, which means to miss the mark. To miss the mark, okay? All have sinned. The conjunction here, and kai. The conjunction that puts this together says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Okay, I digress purposefully here for just a second. In the Old Testament, there are 5 books of poetry, right? One of the huge problems with poetry, potentially, is that you lose a lot of poetry when you go from one language to another. Right? I'll never forget visiting Haiti, and while I'm there, one of the interpreters was telling me about some previous preacher came and preached a sermon, and it all rhymed in English. And it's like, you do know we're going to Creole here, right? Excuse me. Okay, in the books of poetry in the Old Testament, though, in the Hebrew, the form of poetry in the Hebrew language is what kind of poetry? What do we call it?
Hebrew parallelism.
It's called parallelism. And the neatest thing to me, anyway, about parallelism is God knew what he was doing, because parallelism can go to any language. You can translate it to any language. You don't lose the meter, you don't lose rhyme. There are some nuances that are hard to get from one language to another. But parallelism can go from one language to any other language, because parallelism it can be synonymous parallelism, it can be antithetical parallelism, it can be different kinds of parallelism. But parallelism, what is parallelism? Setting up a parallel. So you make one statement, then you either make a synonymous parallel statement, or you make an antithetical parallel statement. The neat thing about poetry literature, what are the poetry books of the Old Testament? Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and the one that came before Psalms? Job. Okay, the neat thing about parallelism that's really helpful to you and me is if you ever run into a line that you just don't quite understand what that means, it's parallelism. So all you have to do is read the next line. Okay, sometimes it'll be 3 or 4 lines that parallel the 3, but you can pretty much pick up on that, right? Isn't that kind of neat that God would use something like that so that it helps us? Why am I spending so much time on this? Because a lot of the Hebrew influence comes into the New Testament. This is Jewish people, right? So many are the times. Jesus, in his prayer, is teaching us how to pray, says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. What does that mean? What does thy kingdom come? What does that mean? Thy kingdom come. I don't know why I'm saying this in King James, but it's just coming out. King James. Okay. Your kingdom come. What does it mean for your kingdom to come? Your king. That means you be king. What does that mean? You be king. That means everybody...
Be recognized.
Yeah, be recognized. Everybody does what you say to do. Isn't that the exact same thing as your will be done? Yeah, it's a parallel statement. Jesus does a lot of that. Especially quoting the Old Testament, getting some of these things across. This is a great example of that. It took me forever to say that. Okay. What is it? Romans 3:23? For all have sinned. What does that mean? Fallen short of the glory of God. It means the exact same thing. In fact, you know the word, you know that's what it means, because it means missing the mark. Let me tell you why I don't mind belaboring this point. This is so important. Sin is lawlessness. It's violating the law of God. What is the law of God? The law of God is an expression of who God is. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. You notice what it says there? It does not say all have sinned and broken God's laws. It says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. What is God's glory?
Who he is in all his
Yeah. God in all his richness and his purity, the essence of God,
perfection.
the glory of God. Which, by the way, he can't be anything but glorious. I mean, we're talking about God here. But nonetheless, it's emphasizing that aspect. God in his nature. Okay, forgive me for covering ground maybe we've talked about before, but I think this is worthwhile. One of the things we have to do is shift our way of thinking. When we think about God, we're not thinking about a human, we're thinking about God. He's infinite in nature, we're finite. So much more to it than that. God's nature is not like our nature. So when we talk about laws are an expression of the nature of God. What does that mean? It's an expression of who God is. I'm going to say that again because I really want this to register. It's an expression of who God is. It is not an expression of what God wants. It's not an expression of what God likes. I'm sure he wants it, I'm sure he likes it. But the essence is it's an expression of who he is. Some of the illustrations that keep coming to my mind would be illustrations along the line of if you are riding in a car with me and you play a radio station I don't like, country, western music, sorry. But you play something like that, you know what? I'm not going to have a heart attack and die. You know, I may not like it. May pull out the hearing aid. You know, they just right. But it doesn't violate my nature as a person. It's something I don't like. It doesn't violate my nature. What would violate my nature? Oh, if you were a karate expert and you could do, as kids, they always said that Bruce Lee could pull your heart out of your chest. I'm sure it is. But let's pretend like he could. Okay, you hold your arm just right and he could rip your heart right out of your chest while you're standing up. Well, you know what? That would more than offend me. It wouldn't just bother me. Why? Because that's part of my nature. What's my nature? My nature is I'm flesh and blood. I've got to have a heart pumping in here for me to live. So if somebody rips my heart out, it doesn't make any difference how I feel about it. I'm not going to live. Right? Okay, so when we say laws are an expression of the nature of God, not the preference of God, not the likes of God, but the nature of God, then what are we saying? We're saying what this verse is saying. Sin is against God, not against what he wants. Let me give you a better example. Why does God say not to lie? It's a sin. And why is it a sin? Because
He cannot.
yeah, here, catch that. The Bible says God tells us not to lie because he cannot lie. Do you notice that? He doesn't say he doesn't like lying. I know he doesn't. So when I say things like it's not a matter of his liking, you understand what I mean by that, right? What I'm trying to emphasize is it's much more than that. It's the nature of who he is. So we'll get into this more. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I want to lay this out. Does that make a little more sense of why this is such a big deal? If you ripped the heart out of my chest, that would be a really big deal in my life, right? If you violate the very nature of God. To sin is not to do something. One of the other things that helped me, growing up, I would think about, I know the things my mom wanted me to do as far as keep my room clean and stuff like that. And my thought was, sorry, Mom. Thinking to myself, she'll just get over it. I was not a real good kid. She'll just get over it. The reason I'm saying things like this is I've actually heard people say things very like that when they think about sin. Well, God will forgive me. You know what you're saying? You're saying, oh, he'll get over it. you're betraying a total misunderstanding of what sin is. It is not violating a standard that He has set up. It is violating who He is. So to me, it always helps to think of it in this light. It's not a matter of, oh, he'll get over it. No, it's a matter of, I just took a knife and threw it into his eyes. I just spit in his face. That's what my sin does. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? This idea of the nature of God is just huge. Okay, now we can look at these verses because something very interesting is set up here in the book of Romans. And this is one of the things we talked about Sunday. Go back up to verse 20. It says in verse 20, therefore no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of the fact that we are sinners. So the law, the expression of the nature of God, can I say it that way? Expression of who He is, makes us realize that we haven't lived up to that standard. Okay, flip over to chapter 7. Chapter 7, verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. Indeed, I would not have known what sin was except through the law. Okay, doesn't that sound kind of like verse 20? What does the law do? The law actually gives me a peek into the nature of who God is. Well, at the same time, it lets me know not just who God is, it lets me know how big a deal this thing is that I did wrong or failed to do or had a heart against. Inside or outside, puts it in the proper perspective. This is huge. I've often used the illustration, and I won't bore you with this again, but the short version of this is if you're one of these kind of people who vents, which I've heard statistics on this, that venting doesn't work. You think it's going to, I'm getting off track again. But anyway, if you're one of these people who vent, and you're, I don't know, you're watching a football game where your team clearly won, and the officials decide, oh no, we're going to give it to the other team at the end of the game, and you're just so, and you're standing by a wall, and you turn around, and you just kick the wall, right? And hopefully it's kind of wall you didn't do a whole lot of damage, right? You're just one of those kind of people who just, you turn around and kick the wall. But if you turned around to kick the wall, and there was a police officer standing there, and you were just turning around to kick the wall, but you kicked a police officer. Is there any difference here? Huge difference, because it's not so much what you do, it's who you do it to. Sin is a violation of the nature of the Creator God of the galaxies. I think we're in pretty big trouble. This is just huge. When we understand what the nature of sin is. Okay, now these next two passages, though, this is what I really wanted to get to a minute ago. Chapter 4, verse 15. Chapter 4, verse 15. Because law brings wrath. By the way, does that make sense? 6:23 also says the wages of sin is death. We already did this. What's the definition of death?
Lacking in life.
Okay, lacking of life where life is the norm, life is to be expected. Because you wouldn't say a rock is dead, would you?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And that's very true. But when we talk about spiritual death, what is spiritual death? Yeah, it's not having life with God. You've missed out on a relationship, a living relationship with God. That's been removed, right? Okay, if the wages of sin is death, does that make sense? Do you understand what sin is? It's an expression of who He is. It's like ripping my heart out. You've just killed me, right? To do that to God means, you know what? You don't have a relationship with God. It's not a matter of, well, I'm upset here. Why can't God get over it? He can't get over it. This is His nature. We're thinking in human terms. We're not thinking in godly terms, right? So the wages of sin is death. The first part of this verse makes sense because law brings wrath. I hope that makes sense. It's not saying, oh, God gets all sorts of upset. We're not talking about, oh, I offended Him again. I'm sorry. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the heart coming out of my chest. God cannot exist this way. Because it's the expression of who He is. Okay, so when it says, because law brings wrath, here's the rest of the verse. And where there is no law, there's no transgression. Okay, we talked about this Sunday for those of you who are in class. But God expresses His nature. We've already got this, right? Law is an expression of the nature of God, who He is. There are three major ways that God expresses His nature. The most detailed one's right here. This is how we find out. I could easily say this is how we find out the standards of God, and that'd be right. But here's what I'm going to say. This is it. This is where we find out who God is. I just said the same thing. Does that make sense? Because His standards are an expression of who He is. Okay, this is the clearest place, but there's two other places. This is Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2. Two other places where we find out about God. Where do we? Chapter 1, verse 18 and following, we find out about God where? In nature. Okay, what's His number one example for the revelation of God in nature? You're not going to know that lying is a sin just by observing nature. You're not going to know some of the specifics. But what are some of the things that you are going to know? What's the example that He gives in Romans chapter 1? Okay, you're going to know that God exists.
Divine nature.
But as far as sin, violating that nature, what's an example of sin?
Creation?
What?
Through creation, you're saying right now?
Romans chapter 1, what's an example of sin in that passage?
Oh, disobeying parents?
Not in Romans chapter 1.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
Romans chapter 1, his classic example is all you have to do is live on the planet to know that if all the boy dogs got together with all the boy dogs and all the girl dogs got together with all the girl dogs, we'd never have any more dogs. He talks about homosexuality in the first chapter. He does.
Yeah.
And you know why? Because that's something you don't have to have the Bible to know that one. Nature cannot exist if things go that way. Okay, Romans chapter 2. So Romans chapter 1 would be the example of God revealing Himself through nature. Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15 says there's another way that God reveals Himself, and that is in this innate. What does innate mean?
Part of His nature.
Yeah, part of your nature. It's just there. Nobody taught this to you. Okay, so if it's innate to human nature, then I would take it, whether you were taught Confucianism or Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or whatever, this is going to be something in everybody. What is innate to human nature? Well, there are certain moral standards that are innate to human nature. Just some real basic ones that just about everybody can look at and say, oh, that was bad. Right? And I know it has to be extreme for some people, but nonetheless, we can all say, that the whole truckload of little girls that were raped and beheaded yesterday, that was a bad thing. And most of us. Innate, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because you got all these people out there that don't believe in God, but they're always screaming about it's not fair.
Ah!
What's
What do you
fair?
mean fair?
What's fair?
Yeah.
Without God, that's what this.
Thank you.
Where there is no law, there is no transgression. So if there is not God's law, you're free to do whatever.
You're exactly right.
There isn't anything to say that's wrong. That's not fair.
You're exactly right. As soon as somebody gets to that point, on the inside, I'm doing the yay, we're gonna win, because eventually, as soon as somebody concedes the fact that oh yeah, I agree, that's wrong. I tell you what, you have to have a creator God for there to be right and wrong. There has to be design to the universe to be right and wrong. If there is a pure accident, I don't care what lengths you go to, you have no solid foundation. You can have an agreed consensus. You can have something that's subjective to your heart, but you've got no objective, concrete, this is absolutely always wrong. Just don't have that, not with an accident. Okay, but here's the point I'm trying to build up to, though. If God reveals Himself through nature, and He does, He reveals Himself innately in the conscience, and He does, and He reveals Himself through the Word, there's different ways that God has revealed Himself. The word being used here is law. But He says where there is no law, which, by the way, He's saying there is some places where there is no law. Then there's no sin. He didn't sin. How do I know He didn't sin? Because there's no law. But wait a minute, you just got through saying nature, conscience, Not everybody's got a copy of the Bible, grant you that. But everybody's got a brain, and everybody lives in this world. The answer is?
They don't understand or know baby level.
Babies. Babies or mentally handicapped people. There are people who never grasp. You know, I know there's this whole area of psychology as far as people who have no moral compass. But we're not just talking about conscience, we're also talking about nature. Not being able to understand what the significance is of observing nature, as well as understanding the standards of God. That would be mentally handicapped people and babies. I want to come full circle here. Does that make sense? Why is it they didn't sin? Because they didn't break any laws. What is breaking a law? It's attacking God. It's anti-God. Okay, I'm taking a long way around here just to try to emphasize the idea of the seriousness of sin. It's an attack on the very nature of who God is, and because of that, it puts us at odds with God. It separates us from God. Flip over to James chapter 2. I think I've got this. I like this one. I won't take time to read it. But Psalm 2, the first 3 verses, it says, "Why do the nations roar?" And the picture there is shaking their fists at God. And you might read that and say, "Oh man, what terrible group of people ever did that?" Everybody who's ever lived. And here's the irony of it. A lot of us don't even realize we did it. But when we did, sometimes in our heart, or sometimes the thing that we knew we shouldn't have done or failed to do, what we were really doing that's what we were doing. Realize it or not, we were shaking our fists at God. We were saying, "Nah, I'm going to do it my way. Not let God do that." Okay, James chapter 2. James chapter 2. Whoever gets there first. James chapter 2.
For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it.
Okay, does that make sense? That's a great verse. If you're perfect in every way, you only break one sin, break one law, commit one sin, you're guilty of the whole thing. Does that make sense? Because what is sin?
Going against the nature of God.
Going against the nature of God. So this is an analogy always worked for me. You only have to be 3 feet overboard to be in trouble. You can be 6 miles off the cruise line in the middle of the Pacific, or you can be just 3 feet off. If the ship's going away and you're off the boat, you're off the boat. Okay. I always want to quickly add, this is not saying all sins are the same. How do we know not all sins are the same? What's the classic passage here?
Jesus talks about the people that are accusing him, you have done a greater sin.
Yes. Jesus is talking to Pilate, and he says, "Those who handed me over to you are guilty of a greater sin." So if Jesus said it, I'd say it's correct. And he said some sins are greater. You know what? That just makes sense, right? Some sins, all sin is rebellion against God, whether people realize it or not. But some sins do a whole lot more damage. They're just a whole lot worse. They're a whole lot more removed from the nature of God than other sins are. So I don't want us to get in trouble there. But while we're still in James chapter 2, what does verse 11 say?
For he who said, "You shall not commit adultery," also said, "You shall not murder." If you do not commit adultery, but you do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker.
Yeah, I love this. He's emphasizing the idea of verse 10. He says, you may be perfect in a lot of areas, but if you broke one law, you're a lawbreaker. But notice he doesn't just say, because they all come from the same, because they're all laws. He says, because he who said this is also he who said that. You get what he's getting at? He says it comes from the same nature. It's the expression of, they're all an expression of God. So you may be more in tune with part of the nature of God than the other nature, but it's still anti-God, right? I hope that makes sense. Let's turn back to Genesis chapter 3. We'll finish with this one because this is such a classic passage, but I want to make sure we have time to review this. Genesis chapter 3. The essence of what we're talking about when we talk about sin. Of course, from the godly perspective, it's against the nature of who he is. But from our perspective, let me just throw this on the table. The core of sin is selfishness. That's what boils down to. It's easy to say, but I want us to unpack that. Genesis chapter 3. Is everybody there? Genesis chapter 3, let's just look at this together. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals that the Lord God had made. Many are the times in Scripture that Satan is referred to as the serpent, and there's debate as to whether or not he slithered in the serpent's body or not. And I'll be honest with you, it doesn't make any difference to me. The idea of being a serpent means being deceptive. Being deceptive. Snake-like, or maybe he did come in the form of snake. Right? Whatever. Anyway, there are several references where Satan is referred to as the serpent. So we're talking about Satan here. And he came to the woman and he said, Did God really say? By the way, when he says it that way, what is he suggesting before he says anything else? He says, did he really say? Yeah, casting some doubt here. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? What did God say?
It's not even from the tree of knowledge.
Yeah, God says you can freely eat from all the trees in the garden except knowledge, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the one tree that you're not supposed to eat. That's what God had said. So Satan comes and he casts this doubt. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden. She left something out there. What was it that God told her?
Freely?
Yeah, you can freely eat from. Okay, that might sound like such a nitpicky little thing. I think it's significant, though. She's leaving out a little bit of what God said, making it a little less special than what God had said. She left out the freely part. We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat from the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die. Okay, she added something here. What did she add? God never said not touch it. She also changed something else. When she said, you're not supposed to eat of the tree or touch it or you will die, and I should have checked with Seth on the Hebrew here, but as I understand this, the Hebrew actually could be interpreted, you might die. There's a little bit of doubt here. It's not strong, the way she says it here. Well, God said, don't eat of this tree or you will surely die. It's a very strong way that God said it. So, between Satan and Eve, before we've gone any further, what we've got here is a little bit's left out, a little bit's added to, and a little bit's changed. That's exactly the way Satan tempted Jesus. He didn't say, Jesus, let's go over here and murder 18 people. He didn't say, let's do something drastically wrong. He took good things and just twisted them just a little bit because you get them off kilter a little bit. Satan understands, well, I don't have to get you a mile off the boat. I just have to get you one step. Right? And you're off the boat. So just a little bit away. So he's got her set up here. Notice his response, and this part I really wanted to get to. Verse 4. You will not surely die. He's contradicting what God has said. He's planting doubt. Oh, you're not going to die. Serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. By the way, there's probably a lot of truth in what he's saying here. But it's the motive behind it. He's saying, you know what? God's against you. God's setting up a boundary. Why do you let God tell you what to do? Why don't you do what you want to do? You'll be like God. You know what? You will be like God. You'll be playing your own God when you decide you're going to do what you want to do. Right? To me, this is kind of a tragedy because sometimes in my own life I decide to do the right thing because I've decided to do the right thing. And that really saddens me because to do the right thing means it's God who decides what the right thing to do is. I still get a little bit of my selfish self in there. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some of it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her. Who was with her. Again, we talked about this briefly Sunday. What distinction does the New Testament make between Adam and Eve in the first sin? What does it say about Eve? It says she was deceived. What does that imply about Adam? Standing there watching the whole thing and he knew exactly what was going on.
Like Jack.
So who's credited as the first sinner?
Adam.
In the sense of willful disobedience, it was Adam. It was Adam. But the heart of it, the essence here, that gets us shaking our fist at God, whether we realize it or not, the heart of it is because, whether we realize it or not, I want to be my God. I want to be my own God. Selfishness. That's why I'm sorry, but I'm always scared to death when people talk about, I just need a little me time. I'm like, no. We all need more God time. You know, maybe life's rough and you're overstressed and stuff like that, but don't talk about me time. Don't talk about, because you're going down a path that Satan wants you to go. He wants you to think about yourself and your own needs. The reality is the best thing you and I can ever do for ourselves, stop thinking about ourselves. Best thing you can do for yourself, don't focus on yourself. Because when you focus on God, what happens to yourself is going to be so much better than what you ever could possibly do for yourself. Well, I've dominated all talk tonight. I'm so sorry for that. We're not done with this. Sorry. There's some more sinful stuff to talk about. But I want us to get a good grasp of this because sin is such a huge problem. You got to understand the problem before you understand the cure. And God has the cure for this. But does it make sense so far? As far as the essence of what we're talking about and how we got there. Any questions, comments? First.
So, when it says that Adam was the first one who sinned, they're just talking about people, because the person who sinned first was Satan.
Thank you. That's right.
Because he's the original sin, right?
Yeah. When we talk about the first sinner and the fall, we talk about the fall appropriately so. Falling away from our relationship with God. Yeah, we're talking about humankind. Yeah. And we're talking about Adam in the sense of a willful sin. He's first. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Let me just tell you where we're going from here. Sin does get us into problems with our relationship with God, but I want to better understand that. And I'm going to use the outline of it's a double trouble and God's got a double cure. In fact, more accurately, there's a double trouble and God's got a triple cure for the double trouble. So we'll pick up there next week. We're over time, so let's pray.